Good evening, friends. Welcome to Life with God. In this third episode of season 2, we're going to study God's presence, and our special guest this evening is Dr. Rahel Wells. Dr. Wells is Associate Professor of Old Testament in the Undergraduate School of Religion at Andrews University. And this is the second time we have her in the program, and I'm so delighted to have you, Rahel, back as part of the conversation tonight. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
You're welcome.
Also, part of the discussion, we have Joseph and Adrian. Welcome back. Kian and Nicola. Welcome. As usual, for the first few minutes of the discussion, we'd like to know the guest a little bit. So, Rahel, we have some questions for you. What is a travel memory that you cherish?
Going to Israel with my parents as a kid, living there for a while. It was great.
What is your favorite animal?
An ant.
Hmm.
What is
your favorite season?
Winter. Most definitely winter.
Yes. What is the name of your cat and why did you call it that?
Her full name is Calamane, and that is the Greek word for straw colored, and she's orange. And yet I spelled it with mane like a tiger, or like a lion. So it's like kind of a mix between a cat and Greek.
Nice.
Even though I teach Old Testament, I don't know, but.
Would you describe yourself as an introvert or an extrovert?
Oh, extreme extrovert. I struggle when I'm not around people.
What is a favorite aspect of nature?
Everything. Nature is like my favorite place to be. So hiking, backpacking, camping, skiing, all of it. Animals, flowers.
I know as the professor of Old Testament, you teach Hebrew. What is a Hebrew word you particularly enjoy?
Chesed
Hey.
is everything good about God. All the good characteristics of God and how much he loves us and is faithful to us.
What is your favorite exercise?
That is so challenging. I like a lot of them. Probably either hiking or swimming or cross-country skiing, one of the three.
What thought or object gets you through the day?
That God is faithful and patient with me.
Besides grading deadlines, what's your least favorite aspect of teaching?
Committees. I have to be on a lot of them. Not as many as some people, thankfully, but yeah, I'm not a huge fan of committees. I think committees are important, but I don't really like them.
What are some of your cherished spiritual practices?
Probably my best times with God are when I'm a night owl, so I like to walk outside at night under the stars and talk with God. That's some of my favorite times. Also music really connects me with God. So when I'm listening to certain songs, I feel very close to God.
You mentioned that you spent some time in Israel as a kid. What was something you learned about God while you were there?
I think it was just so amazing to me to walk where Jesus walked, like probably on some of the same stones, when you go down in the layers there. And it's just, I don't know, that's still just, I've been there multiple times since then, but that's still just probably one of my favorite things. Like I'm literally walking on the place where people I read about in the Bible thousands of years ago. It's just, it's like nothing else to me.
Who is your favorite Bible character?
Oh, wow. That's a really tough one. Probably Daniel, honestly. Just his faithfulness to God through so many trials and tribulations, and yet he was continually faithful, even in the small things. And yet he was also willing to confess and be a part of his people, as a sinner. And I don't know, I just really, his character amazes me. I could pick lots of other people for other reasons, but.
Do you find praise or criticism to be more motivating?
It depends on the situation, I think. You know, if I feel like I've done terrible at something, then praise is like really meaningful to me. But if I feel like, oh, hey, I did this pretty well, you know, then like criticism can be really helpful for me because I'm like, oh, wait, actually, I didn't think about this angle, or I didn't, you know.
Mhm.
So it kind of depends on the situation, I think.
If there's a specific location you'd go to feel more connected with God, where would that be?
On top of a mountain.
What is your favorite cuisine?
Uh, fresh food that's plant-based.
Okay. Thanks so much, Rahel.
You're welcome. It's fun.
My friends, tonight we are discussing God's presence, and this is episode 3. I am enjoying this season more and more with each episode as we dig into the topic. The special focus in this episode, in this conversation, is going to be God's presence in the Old Testament. So now we're really starting to dig into the Bible, into the Scripture, and see how the Bible portrays God's presence and what can we learn about the concept by understanding it in God. And so, Rahel, to open the discussion, this is my question. What are some of the ways in which God manifests his presence in the Old Testament, especially, but also in the Bible in general?
Yeah, so this is such a big question. Obviously, the Old Testament is very large and has different sections, and God shows his presence in different ways, I think, at different times. But one of my favorite ways is really through the prophets. And of course, the prophets really, you see people who have prophecies. Moses is a prophet. There are other people that are prophets through the earlier part of the Old Testament, but most of the people that we consider prophets wrote towards the end of Israel and the end of Judah as a nation. And so they're really God trying to enter into the lives of his people in a way that maybe other ways haven't worked. And he's willing to pull out all the stops to try to reach them. And so you have a bunch of prophets that come right before the end of Israel and a bunch of prophets that come right before the end of Judah. And these are most of our writing prophets that we think of between Isaiah and Malachi. And I think what impacts me, that's probably my favorite section of the Old Testament, honestly. I mean, whatever section I'm working with, I love, but I really love the prophets. And I think it's because they're often misunderstood. So many times people, when they read the prophets, they don't understand why God seems harsh, why God does these seemingly crazy things, like asking Hosea to marry a prostitute, asking Ezekiel to lay on one side for 390 days on another side for 40 days, right? And like eat siege rations, and then take a sword and cut off his hair and his beard and like scatter it to the wind and burn it in the fire. I mean, like crazy stuff God asked the prophets to do. And so people have said, well, they must be crazy, right? But I think really when you look at the depth of their experience with God, it really is that, an experience. They understand God's heart, and God understands, or God speaks to the people through their hearts. And so they're able to share, I think, many deeper things about God's presence and God's character and who God is to the people, and to try to wake them up and bring them back to God, because this is right before the end of the nation of Israel and right before the end of the nation of Judah, and the people are very, very sinful. And so God, it's interesting when you read the prophets, it's often hard to tell, is it the prophet talking or is it God talking? And it's almost like sometimes you don't even have, God says this or the prophet says this. It's just, I say, right? Or I think this or whatever, or I will do this. And it's many times hard to even tell apart. So I love that aspect of God, that he doesn't just thunder from a mountain like you see on Sinai, right? Which he does also, but he is entering into so close of a relationship with these individuals that he is then able to speak his heart through them. So I think of Hosea specifically, because often people are like, how could God make him marry a prostitute, right? How is that fair to him? but it's really to represent God's heart, because God was married to Israel and Israel was unfaithful to him over and over and over and over again. And so um, by entering into this relationship and this marriage relationship with Gomer, Hosea has children, he's connected with her, he loves her, and then she leaves him again, right? And she's unfaithful to him. And so he is able to really know that like mix of anger and compassion and love. And you see this through his book where he's just like, I don't want to give you up, but I'm so mad at you, right? And so like God's emotions are really on display. God's heart, God's passion for his people, God's interaction with his people come out through the lives of the prophets more so than many other places, I think. And so it's more than just God's message. It's also like a person that he connects with and enters into life with. And so they're able to share this in a way that very few other people can, I think. So that's one of the ways I think that we see God's presence, and we can maybe talk about that more a little bit, but I also want to mention at least one other way. And I think that is through the covenants that God makes with his people. So there's really this, we've often tended to think of multiple covenants through the Old Testament, and there are multiple covenants, but the reason there are multiple ones is because the people break them. So it's not that God is changing his mind or making something new or different. So for instance, in Jeremiah 31, he talks about the new covenant, and he says, this is Jeremiah 31, verse 31. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, right? So God is making this quote unquote new covenant, or he promises to make it, but it's new because it's a renewal of the original one that the people broke. The people didn't want God. They reject him, right? So we see this both through this marriage metaphor, and of course, marriage as a type of covenant as well. And then God says in verse 33 of Jeremiah 31, this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. So God's presence comes through his Torah, through his word written on the hearts of his people. And then he says, and I will be their God and they will be my people. So it's this close relationship of close covenant care relationship between the two of them, or between God and his people. And then verse 34, no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me. So it's this close knowledge connection. So God's presence comes through his covenant. And then he says, for I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. And this concept of forgiveness, of course, in the Old Testament has this idea of bearing the sin on himself. So he, in his presence with his people, he's also taking their iniquity. And all of these elements of of this new covenant are present in all of the previous covenants, with Noah, with Moses on Sinai, with David, with Abraham. All of those elements are there. So God isn't recreating or making some sort of new covenant. He's renewing these elements that have always been present there, showing his presence through their hearts, really. So this is, I think, what God ideally wanted, was to connect with them through their hearts. But many times the people rejected him and were not willing. So I think those are two of the main elements. There's lots of other ways God's presence is seen, but those are the two I'd like to at least start us talking about and thinking about.
I have a question then.
Yeah.
This is just to kind of clarify a bit. Would you say then that the better the people are at maintaining their covenant with God, the closer and more present God is with them? Or is that like the wrong way of thinking of it?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think God is present always, right? It's just whether the people are willing to open their hearts to him. So he talks a lot actually in the prophets about how, he's there, he's like ready, but they're closing their hearts, So actually in the same book where the new covenant is mentioned at the beginning of Jeremiah, I mean, he's saying like, the people have totally rejected me. I'm here. I want to be their husband, right? But the people are like, we don't care. We're shedding our hearts to you, and we would rather turn the other way away from God. So they either turn away from God in disobedience, right? Where they're totally disobeying God, and that's mostly what Israel does, or in legalism, right? So this also happens where the people will try to work their way to God, and by doing these things that they feel that they are closer to God. So, but I think you're right in the sense that there's so much in the Bible about how the people are really turning from God, and then they have a misconception of how they should get back to him when it's really their heart.
Mm. I have a comment on that actually. Recently, I read last week about how sin separates us from God, but not that God can't be near us, but that because we sin, we choose not to be near God. And the example was Adam and Eve. When they sinned, God was looking through them in the garden, like, where are they? So God wasn't trying to go away from them, but they were hiding from him. So the sin was us removing ourselves from God rather than God's too holy, he can't be near us. But God's
Correct.
seeking us.
Correct. God even wanted initially, I believe, and this is not my thought, but I've gotten this from many other people pointing this out, that God initially, when he makes the covenant on Sinai, he wants all of the people to come up to be with him, right? Mm-hmm. He wants to eat with them and connect with them. This is what he ends up doing with the 70 elders and Moses, right? But the people are terrified. They're like, nope, we don't want to send Moses, right? So they are already in this place of, no, we don't want to. We're putting up a wall between us and God, right? And yet God is like desperate to be close to them. He very much wants to, I believe.
This all is getting me really thinking about how, in many ways, presence is a subjective experience, because the objective reality of God being there, God upholds the entirety of creation, so there's a sense in which God has to be present because we're still breathing. So just from a very baseline, the fact that our atoms aren't completely dispersing into nothingness indicates to me that God is present. Yet so often we don't feel that God is present. And I think that really, when it comes to presence, when it comes to thinking about God being present, I think that most people, when they say, God isn't with me, God isn't near, I think that really they're not trying to say objectively. I feel like many people would intellectually agree, of course God is, but I don't feel him. Where is he? And so, like, when you were talking about the prophets, and okay, Hosea, I need you to go marry Gomer. Are you sure? Yes, I need you to go marry Gomer. I think that oftentimes in this world, it looks to me like presence requires a human element. It seems to me like without the human presence, the divine presence gets missed. And so, God needed, priests, God needed prophets, God needed, he finds some people who can manifest his presence in a flesh and blood tangible way, and I'm just reflecting on the fact that, like, I don't know if we can really, like, totally narrow down objectively presence, but I think from the subjective experience, God's presence needs us in a way. And I don't even know if that sounds sacrilegious, like God needing us, but in the same way, I almost feel like God's presence needs us.
Well, I don't think you're crazy at all, because this is why Jesus comes, right, as a human, right? So it's like, and yet I think you're right. God wouldn't have to use us, but he chooses to, right? And I think that this is part of it too, right? So he chooses to work through us, and this is why he chooses Israel, right? He's like, no, I want to manifest my presence through Israel as a people. And his intent, I believe the prophets indicate this, and he tells this to Abraham. He's like, I want you to bless the world, right? Through you. So he could just do it himself, but he chooses. This is the incredible thing I think about God's presence, which you're getting at, Nick, which is like this God choosing to work through people, faulty, messed up people, right? Who, the prophets are no saints. They struggle too, and yet God still works through them.
Can I just push back on that though? Like the idea that God, because for me, I don't know, part of me is thinking about, like, okay, if God could do this in another way, where it's like God just in himself, bam, everybody knows I'm present, bam, everybody gets me, I mean, if he could do that, I don't know why he wouldn't do that to a degree. Like for me, like I know he's like powerful enough where he could make himself be known to everybody, but I almost wonder if there are priorities or thoughts, or I mean, going to the covenant you were talking about, the covenant is relationally based and faithfulness, and has that I mean, your favorite word is chesed. It has that essence of like how great God is in it. And I almost wonder if it's like if it's not too much to say God can't manifest himself in the world without people, because to do it any other way would somehow violate covenantal faithfulness to us. If somehow, like, my thing is like, if God's presence were to be manifested so tangibly that everybody on earth would have to recognize him, their freedom to recognize him, their freedom to enter a relationship with him would be removed. And there wouldn't even be the option of a loving relationship of I trust you. There would be the simple recognition of, oh my goodness gracious, you're here and I can't avoid it. And so in a sense, if God wants to not just be present with us, but be present in a way of love, I don't think it's actually too far to say that he can't do it a better way than he is doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'd want to go so strongly as he can't, right? Because at least we get the indication in the garden that he walks with Adam and Eve, right? So, but perhaps after sin, right? Maybe that's a way of putting it. I do think, though, you're right in the sense that like God, well, and I like to see a tension there, right? So I don't think it's either or, because God also made Adam and Eve to need each other. So, right, like we are not just complete as single individuals with God. So he made, and maybe this gets at it, maybe it's this tension between both of them, right? Because God does appear, like, and I think this was his desire on Sinai, to have this close relationship with each person there. But they weren't willing, they were afraid, right? So he mediates through Moses. But he also created us to need each other. So it's the both and. I don't think you can separate them out, right? God has this intimate, close relationship with each one of us. And yet he also, and I don't know, I think about this when I talk about dating, right? So maybe this is a good way to think about it, or marriage. Do you have to, are you required, do you need marriage to, is God enough, right? To like never be married? I think God is enough, but God doesn't fulfill all of those needs that you have. That's just reality, right? So if you don't get married, there's still, most people have that longing for companionship, and you can feel that through other people. But God made us that way. So it's not an either or, right? God is enough for you. God is our husband, he says. He's our wife. He's whatever. He's our spouse, right? And yet he also created us to need other people. So I don't know. I think it's kind of a both and. I'm not sure you can just say one or the other.
It seems to me that maybe going back to the concept of before the fall, and then thinking also of after sin, when sin is eradicated, that initially human beings had an unmediated presence with God. And that's what we look forward to also in Revelation 21, where God will be in our midst. His capital will be on the new earth. And so we'll be in the unmediated presence of God, and he in our presence in some way. So it seems to me that the context of sin does require maybe a different kind of presence. And now the question that's in my mind is precisely that: what is the difference? Maybe is there a different purpose of God's presence within the context of sin as opposed to outside of a context of sin? Because he didn't have to be veiled with Adam and Eve, so they didn't have to recognize, right, his existence and his presence. He was right there. They couldn't deny it. But going back to Nicolas's comment, in our context of sin, we have to accept God's existence. And so my question is more about purpose. I don't know if it makes sense or not, but
yeah, it does. And I think I would nuance that even a little bit more, because I do think God still does connect one-on-one with people even after sin, through the angel of the Lord, right? So the angel of the Lord is God, and we see this clearly throughout. In fact, we usually don't think about this, but the one who is in the burning bush that talks with Moses, that's the angel of the Lord, and says, I am Yahweh, right? And so there's still this element of God desiring to be close with people. And yet most people that meet the angel of the Lord are terrified and think they're going to die, right? So, and this is maybe what gets at it, right? How God can, God doesn't want to terrify people. So many times he does use people, right? But, and yet even like Adelina, I'm not sure, because before sin, he still says he makes Adam to need people, right? So I even think that that's there before sin as well. It's not just an after sin thing, but it does seem to change on some level in other ways, right? So
and I don't think it's like before sin we didn't need people, and after sin we can only see God through people. But I do think, like, before everything got messed up, and before we as a people have collective trauma that makes God terrifying to us, I think that there was a sense in which, yes, my heart needs other people. Like, I need you guys. I would have needed you all, whether, the world had, gone to hell in a handbasket or not. I would have still needed you. But I think that there would have still been the sense of, like, I could actually bask in the full, unveiled presence of God at that time as well, as opposed to now, where it's like God wants that one-on-one relationship with me, but he can't be completely and totally unmasked, unveiled. I can't experience the undimmed presence of God, because to do that would actually counteract the relational connection with him. And so it almost makes me think that there are like multiple types of presence. There's like there's like the very, basic, physical presence, of God, which we've lost. But I feel like there's a deeper presence that we want, which is that relational presence. I mean, like, right now, like, we're all engaged with each other. And so, like, in this moment, like, there's a presence that we have, even though we're digital, and this presence has a richness to it that I value more than if we were all sitting in a room and I didn't know who you were and you didn't know who I was and we weren't talking. And so I feel like intuitively, from our experience with other people, we recognize that I actually value something, a kind of presence that's not physical. I value the presence of, I feel like the person is attentive to me, and I'm attentive to them, and we know each other and we're connecting. And I think that we're getting there, an insight into God's heart, where it's like, from all along, God has wanted us to have that presence of not necessarily the physical. The physical is good, but the presence of, like, God, I see you and you see me, and like we're there with each other. And I wonder if there's a sense post fall where, for the majority of people, they aren't able to get that with God until they've seen it through people. And then that touchstone of, I've experienced non-physical, but that emotional integrity presence with someone else. And then it's like, I can start to even formulate, oh, wait a minute. It's possible for God to be present with, I mean, Jesus, when he's going up, I'm with you always. Well, he's not physically here, but he still says he's with us. And so I feel like it's like this right now, like what we're doing right now, helps me understand, how can Jesus be present with me, even though he's not sitting in the room with me?
Well, and this gets at the importance of the prophets and of the covenant, which many of the books are structured around the covenant, right? Because they are speaking not only their words, but God's word, right? So not only are you getting a person, you're seeing God through a person, but you're also getting God's word, which he spoke to that person, spoken to you, right? So this is what makes the Bible so powerful, is you're not just getting people's words, you're actually getting God's words. And so that is where I think you're right. We can start having this conversation with God, even though we don't see him, because we see him, we hear him, right? We hear him speaking, and then we see him through the person of the prophets, or other people that are mediating his word. So I think you're right. I think that it's a complex of things. I mean, God's presence is multifaceted, but as you're getting at, because it's, we also think about creation. I know you mentioned this, like, the Bible talks about, of course, God creating, but he mostly, when it focuses on God as creator, it's his maintenance of us as his creatures, right? So Yes, giving us breath. Every breath is from him. Our blood is from him. Like, that's continual.
Yeah.
So he is always there, but how we see him or feel him or hear him is often helped a lot by other people and by the words he gives to them.
I think maybe a biblical concept to help with this part of the conversation is the image of God, Imago Dei, that we as human beings bear God's image also in the aspect of presence, being present to each other, but also God being present through us to other people. Rahel, there.
And can I piggyback on that? Because I think it's actually also in animals.
Okay.
Because God also, the prophets are full of animals. In fact, if you start reading through them, almost every chapter, there's multiple animal references, and God is using animals to call people out and say, if you were as good as an animal in your relationship with me, you'd be good, right? Like, but you're not. You're worse than an animal, right? So animals also reveal to us presence, the presence of God. And God often uses animals to wake people up and get people's attention and speak to people about who he is and his character. So I agree with you, though. It's all creatures. So the creatures that he makes, he speaks through us, to us, with us, and coming together with the people to praise God ultimately, right? So and you find it in the Old Testament too. Sorry, that was just to piggyback off of what you were saying, because I agree with you. Just
No,
I
but
want to add animals in there too.
we now have two more questions. Well, first of all, let me just say this. One of my students in a Doctrine of God class did some research on God's relationship in the Bible, and he noticed that the word relationship doesn't appear in the Bible in a translation the way we use it today. Instead, covenant is what defines our relationship with God. But the interesting thing for me is because we don't use that word today. I don't think of myself as being in covenant with God. And the first part of the conversation made me raise this question, well, should I think of it this way as opposed to relationship? Because relationship seems very broad. It's helpful, but covenant has a biblical foundation and specific nuances to it that are not a part of our terminology today. And so I'm curious if you can help us more with this understanding of um God's presence through the covenant. Is that something we are in with God, or
Yeah.
he calls us to it? What does that look like as opposed to just relationship, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. And I think that's a really good insight, to think about it as a covenant, because think about our relationship with God as a covenant, because God has what he calls the everlasting covenant, right? Which is actually before sin. He makes it with creatures. And really it takes on different elements with the sanctuary, which we'll be talking about in another session. But it takes on different elements after sin, like this forgiving iniquity. But we actually have in Revelation the same elements. I will be their God, they will be my people. Everyone will know me, right? My law is on their hearts. So like all of those same things are what God intended, I believe, to always connect with his creatures through the elements of a covenant. And so yet the Old Testament points out specific things that are going to be different once Jesus comes. So rather than multiple priests, you have one priest who is Jesus, right? Mediating that covenant. Rather than multiple sacrifices, you have the one sacrifice, which is Jesus. So many of the elements that are different in the New Testament are predicted in the Old. So, but we're still in that everlasting covenant. So and we still have those same elements of that quote unquote new covenant or renewed covenant that are still applicable to us today. So I think it is helpful because it can help us, even though we're not a theocracy anymore. So God's initial, a lot of his covenants with Israel were as a nation, right? Not as individuals. And I think that's what we need to be careful of, realizing we're no longer in this like nation covenant with God, because then we can lead ourselves down to some pretty weird theology, right? Or problematic theology. Because then we think of, which nation then is God's nation, right? I mean, we get into some problems with that, Christian nationalism, etc. So but I do think there is individually, right, as followers of that one high priest, one sacrifice who is Jesus, we are a part of the covenant through him. So yes, our relationship with God as a covenant is so helpful for me to think of, because then it's not just like, oh yeah, if it doesn't work, we're moving on, right? No, God's made a covenant to us. We've made a covenant to him. It's a, it's a, it's a oath, right? It binds us together. It gives certainty and stability to our lives. And I think that this can be really a helpful concept.
From what I've heard, I don't know if this understanding is right, but I just feel like that the question about presence of God is almost a question of God rather than us. Because I just, from this conversation, I just noticed that like animal prophets, like they are the one trying to reach out to the people, like to tell that there's presence of God, right? Well, like of course we often like wander around like, where is God? Like I need your presence, and like we often question about it. But I almost feel like most of the time, because like the Israelites, they didn't want the presence of God, right?
Many
And
times.
it's like an opposite way of like, it's rather than we are searching for the presence of God, it's like God is finding a way to show that I'm here. I don't know if
That's
that
a really good
understanding
point.
is.
So I hear you saying like Israel, I mean, they saw God's presence all the time and they didn't want it,
Mhm.
right? And yet now we are like, where's God, right? Where are you? We can't see you.
Mhm.
I do think there is something to that in the sense that, again, we're not a theocracy anymore, right? So we're not in this direct relationship with God in the same way as a nation.
Mhm.
But I do see some elements of how we are now in the Old Testament as well, right? Where people are crying out to God, they're calling to him, why aren't you acting? Why aren't you doing what we want you to do, or what we think you should do? So I do think there's some, and if you think about the number of times that God appears in the Old Testament versus the time span, it's not very many
Mm.
overall, right? You have the Exodus, massive, Sinai, the establishment of the relationship with Israel, but there's highlights of things, but I do think you're right, Kuhn, that it often is based on us. Like, where are we at? Are we willing to search? Are we willing to open our hearts to God in the way that he's seeking to reach to us?
Mhm.
So, Kiyun, oh my, such a cool thought came into my head from what you were just saying. When you were saying like through the prophets, it's mainly God through the prophets. Like, so anyway, this is just this. We always think about prophecy mainly in terms of words. Either we think about it in terms of like words about the future, or we think about it about words speaking up about present injustice. But we often talk about prophecy mainly through the lens of words.
Mm.
But through the lens of our conversation right now, the thought that's hitting me is that whenever we are engaging in a ministry of presence to other people, where we are trying to mediate God's presence, be that with words or not, when I am trying to consciously be with another person as God is with us and model God's presence to them, I am engaged in prophetic ministry.
Mm.
And so the thought that is hitting me is that all of us collectively in the church, because, like you were saying, Dr. Wells, like God's words came at like these moments of crisis, but there were large spans of centuries where there weren't the words. But I don't believe that meant that there was no prophecy. And I'm starting to think that every single one of us actually can be engaged in the ministry of prophecy by engaging in the ministry of presence with those around us.
Mm.
That's a very good point, because I think you're right. And there's a lot of prophets that didn't write anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we have stories of just their presence. I mean, some of them work miracles, but you have these schools of the prophets who were probably doing a lot of things like ministers and teachers and chaplains are doing today, right? So they were ministering to people. So the prophet, I mean, the word prophet, they're often called seers, people who see, right? And they can see through God's eyes situations and people, but they're also messengers. So they're messengers both through their words, but also through their lives. I think you're right. Their lives, people, they were called men of God or women of God. I mean, there were women prophets as well. So yeah, I think you're so right. We've so often thought of prophecy as just like a foretelling of the future rather than a mission of the whole life that we all have that privilege of participating in.
just from what Nick said, I got another idea too. It's just that the idea of like, so during the Old Testament, the Israelites were the chosen people, right? And like they experienced the presence of God, and they were more directly related to God because of the theodicy. But then what I'm thinking is like they did not want God in a lot of point of times. Like they're like, we refuse your presence. While like during this time, I feel like Christians are like the Israelites, right? But we are like looking so difficultly, we are having a hard time trying to see the presence of God, while in a reverse, the people outside, they refuse. So from what Nick said, I'm feeling like, I think just the idea of the mission or just reaching out to the people is the, probably it could be a hint that God is present with us. Because like Nick just, I mean, like the word prophet seems to be too large for me, so we often feel like, oh, I can't be a prophet. But then I feel like during the time of Israelites, prophet was someone, like Nick said, reach out to the people to tell them and to be with them, while like probably this time we are the one and we just don't notice that. And that presence of God really happens. I mean, it's so easy to find when we start to reach out to people rather than just sitting there and like, where are you, God? And like, we are struggling by ourselves, while the people outside of the world are like, I don't care about the presence of God. I don't want it.
I think that's such a good point. Like taking, rather than focusing on where's God, focus on letting God shine out through you, right? Like, because that has helped me so many times. I cannot tell you the number of times where I have been struggling and God works through me to, or inspires me or urges me to help someone else or bless someone else. And through that, I am blessed. Through that, I see God's working. Through that, I see God's presence. And I think you really hit that, Q, and that is so true, because, and we've often lost that in the church. We're in the church, we're like looking for where we can be blessed, right? Rather than looking to be a blessing, which is what, what can really help us to see God more clearly.
So I think I have a follow-up question to that for you, Rahel, based on this segment of the conversation. When we think of God's presence today, we think of it as something desirable, like we want it. But what transpired in this conversation is that when people had a more tangible presence, they were either scared or they didn't want it, they rejected it, they misinterpreted, or they misinterpreted God's character through that, from the perspective of their experience with that presence, which to me it's it's a little bit shocking, a little surprising. Why would someone reject God's presence? So I wonder if you have any insights about Israel specifically, and this part of their experience with God. Why? Because maybe that applies to us today in some way. Why did they reject God's presence? Was there something we can learn, that there is value in finding our proper place in relation to God? Or is there also something we can learn from them in terms of accepting God's presence?
Those are such good questions. Lots of things are going through my mind, but I think a couple of things. Of course, when Moses gives his final address, which is the book of Deuteronomy, to the people, he calls on them for multiple things. He says, the things that I really need you to do: keep reading the Torah, right? Keep reviewing it, keep thinking of it, keep celebrating the feasts, which were really a remembrance of what God had done for them. And then to keep singing the song. So he wrote them a song at the end of the book, right? And it reviews their whole story, and that they were to sing it and to remember it and to pass on to their children. Well, unfortunately, we find out right after the book of Joshua, when they get into the land, within 1 or 2 generations, they don't keep the feasts anymore. They don't read the Torah. They don't listen. They don't sing. They've taken God out of their lives. And so they've forgotten to do the things that will help them to remember. And I think this is key for me in my own life with God too. So as I'm trying to remember God's presence in my life, I have to be intentional about remembering and doing things that help me remember, whether that be celebrating my baptism or the time when God saved my life. I do that every year because it keeps me remembering what God has done for me, right? So it's like making these intentional times of celebration, which I think we often don't do. But then the other thing would be this idea of just being attracted by the things that were around them. So God told them very specifically, these other gods, these other, religions are going to be very attractive to you, because they were living in an agricultural society, and these gods were like, man, if you do this, we will give you rain. If you do this, we will give you good crops. And so they were they knew, God told them these are going to be very attractive. So you've got to destroy the religion, right? And they didn't do that. And instead they start falling into everything around them. And so I do think it's significant that often, many times, the people that highlight faith in God and trust in him and seeing his presence are not Israelites. Caleb, Rahab, Ruth. I mean, there's all Ruth during the time of the judges. She was a Moabite. Rahab is a Canaanite, and yet she's the one who spoke truth to the spies and was like, look, we're afraid and we believe God's given you the land. And they're like, oh, okay. So then they go back and they take it, right? So like, many times the people that show some of the greatest faith and the greatest belief in God's presence are not Israelite, which I think is really significant to us too, and means to me that God is not just working through believers, right? He is at work all around the world, and we are just a piece of that puzzle.
Sometimes I think we have this tendency to think that we own God's presence. Because I mean, I think about King Josiah. King Josiah was like the best king. I feel like I'm trying to remember. I think that there was even one verse where it almost said that he did better than David in the eyes of the Lord, where it's like God like comparing all of the kings of Judah, were like, yeah, and then Josiah was even better than David. Like, oh, I love Josiah. But then at one point, Pharaoh Necho is coming from Egypt, and Pharaoh Necho says, God has sent me. And then King Josiah didn't believe God could be speaking, that God's presence could be mediated through a non-Israelite. And so he went to a battle God didn't want him to be in, and he died. And I think that sometimes we have this tendency to think, we're the Christians, we've got the Bible, we sing the hymns, so it can't be the case that heathen over there could possibly be speaking truth to me, or God's presence could be mediated through them to me. And I think that what you were just saying, like, we need to realize that God's presence is bigger than us. Even though we mediate God's presence, it's bigger than us, and we don't own it.
I can't tell you how many times one of my best friends is an atheist, and she has spoken truth that I needed to hear. Like, God speaks through her regularly in my life, which is just crazy to me, because it's not what you would expect, right? But I think you're very much right. And so I don't know, Adelina, in answer to your original question, but I think that there's all sorts of reasons why Israelites don't. But one of them is, I think, what Nick is getting at here too, this idea of, thinking, well, we have it all, right? We don't need any more. God has given us everything we need. And so we don't really need to, like, we have the temple, we have the covenant, we have the Davidic king. So we're good. We're going to do whatever we want, and God will still bless us, right? Rather than recognizing that need to continually come to God ourselves and receive from him that covenant relationship. And I think that's what we see many times, these converts to faith coming in and doing better than the Israelites do.
Yeah. Like a sense of entitlement, like they start to own what is in their midst.
This is actually going back to what we talked about at the beginning, Jeremiah. I mean, Jeremiah kind of dismantles. He's like, the temple, forget it. Like that doesn't keep you close to God. The covenant, forget it. Like that doesn't keep you close to God. Like, where is your heart, right? Davidic king, nope. He's like, you're relying on all these like external things rather than letting God into your heart to actually have that relationship with him.
Yeah.
And that's where God really wants to dwell.
I think it's fascinating because, I mean, it's possible that you can become like we can become prideful about God's closeness or nearness or presence in our lives without realizing. But that sense of entitlement, well, I'm special, so maybe God is present with me in way because I'm better than others, but that's just not the case.
There's a question I have that I've been trying to formulate in my head, and just hearing all of these things, I'm gonna attempt to pose it.
Go for it.
Um, it seems that, like Nico was saying, we miss the presence of God, and I'm thinking that, at least for me personally, I only miss God's presence when I realize that bad things are happening in my life. Because if everything is good and like life isn't stressful, then I'm thinking, oh, I don't need God because I'm in a good state. But it's when like I see terrible things happening around me that are affecting me personally, then I think, oh wow, where's God? Oh my goodness, what's happening? And what I just want to know is, from a practical point of view, how do you change your heart, like you were saying, to desire God not only when things are bad, but to also enjoy his presence when things are also good?
If I had the answer to that question, I'd have $1 million probably. but I do think that, I mean, the book of Job continues to help me. It's just this idea of even someone like Job, who seemed to be really close to God even when he was doing well, right? He struggled when things were not going well. And so, like, almost everyone in the Bible struggles when things are not going well. So we are not alone in that. And I think we often read the happy, happy, joy, joy Psalms, but like half the Psalms in the Israelite hymn book were laments. They were mourning. They were like crying out to God and like saying, why, Lord? I don't understand. So I think of the Psalms really for me is my prayer book. So, you know, when I am feeling happy and joyful and things are going well, I can pray those Psalms, right? And it can be words that I can put to my heart and my feelings and my connection with God at that point. And when I'm struggling with God, I can pray those Psalms. And that's really helped me personally to kind of stay closer to God when I'm either when I'm doing well or when I'm not. But I'm with you. This is my struggle too. And I think most people have this struggle. It's very easy when things are going well to just kind of be moving along in your relationship with God, right? And maybe not growing. It's the hard stuff that grows us. This is actually why I think many times God allows things, not because he wants to hurt us. And I think most of the bad things come from Satan, but God allows them to come because we need growth. And many times that's how he reaches us. And I don't think it's like he says to Joseph, right? He allowed tons of bad things to happen to Joseph, even though Joseph didn't deserve them. He had done nothing wrong. And you're a Joseph, right? So you can appreciate this. But like at the end, Joseph is like, you know, God, you meant it for evil. He's talking to his brothers, but God used it for good. Right. So it's like being able to see that bigger perspective at the end and seeing growth. I know that for me, I cannot see growth in the middle of the pain. I'm just angry at God. But later I can look back and be like, oh, wow, God did use that, right? Even though Satan was trying to destroy me, God used it for good. Nick, I think you were going to say something too.
Well, I mean, just like, because like we've been talking about, like, you know, God's presence coming through the prophets, God's presence coming through other people, God's presence coming through us, and how oftentimes it's through someone else being present that we experience God's presence.
Mhm.
One thought that's coming to me is maybe life is going good for me, but it's definitely not going good for everybody I know.
Mhm.
And so I think if I am opening my heart to be present, I mean, like Joseph, let's just say right now you were going through a dark night of the soul. If I'm locked up in myself, I might be having a great time and not even be like thinking about needing God's presence. But if I am present to you and my heart is open to your pain is going to be making me say, God, I need your presence right now because, oh my word, my friend.
Mhm.
And so I think that this is a world where everybody experiences pain. And so even if we're not going through pain, we can open ourselves to others' pain. And I think that might help us be more aware of God's presence and and have a hungering for his presence more often. I think that so often the world is painful and we want to like callous ourselves off to it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to know. It hurts, you know? But I think there's almost a degree where it's like, I need to feel other people's pain. I need to let myself feel their pain. I think Job even did that. Like he was having a good time, but he opened himself to maybe feel his kid's emptiness or his kid's pain, or to feel the, he talks about like, God, whenever I saw somebody who was hurting or hungry, I would like take them to my house, I'd feed them, I'd clothe them. So I think that there was a degree of like, how was Job so close to God when life was good for him? It's because he was so open to other people's pain.
Mhm.
So maybe the word that comes to my mind right now, from everything that is being discussed here, is connection. That being with God being present to us, and seeking our presence, because it's a mutual covenantal relationship, right? It's being aware of each other, but in a way that you're connecting, and the deeper you connect, the more you feel that presence. That may come with a face-to-face relationship, but it doesn't have to, because two people can be in the same space, like Nicola was saying earlier, and not necessarily feel connected. In fact, I'm thinking of marriages where two people have grown apart and they feel more lonely within the marriage than maybe someone who is single feels, because they don't have someone with them, because there's expectation of having that connection, and when it's missing, um, yeah, there is that sense of loneliness and loneliness and lack of being there for each other. Um, so I don't know. I think this word connection helps me understand the concept of presence a little better.
Yeah, we're connecting to God, we're connecting to each other, God is connecting to all of it's yeah, it's like one big connection.
Well, I think we've been talking for close to an hour. I feel like we've touched on different aspects, and we could probably go more in depth on each one of them. But we also need to give some space for these insights to mature in our minds as we continue to think about them on our own, in our own sphere, and maybe discussing them with other friends of ours and family. Um, so if there is any other question, I guess we could take a few minutes. If anyone else would like to raise an aspect of the conversation or have a follow-up question, and if not, we can move into takeaways. Or Rahel, if there is anything that you feel like we should touch on, um, that comes to your mind.
Well, I would just say one more thing, because really the prophets, the covenant, all of this is pointing forward, right? So almost all of many of the prophets are types, are signs pointing forward to Jesus, pointing forward to the Messiah. The covenant itself is coming to a point. I mean, its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross. And so almost every prophet in multiple places, well, I would say every prophet that we have written, right, has that ultimate focus, right? So the reason that gives them hope, the reason that they can see God present in their lives right now, is because they're looking forward to Jesus to come. And so we can do the same. We can look back to Jesus' sacrifice and look forward to his coming again. And this is what gives us hope. So even though we may not see right now everything, they didn't then either, right? So they're looking ahead saying, I believe, I'm hoping, I'm trusting in this Messiah who's going to take my sins on himself and who is then going to come again, and I'm going to live through eternity with him. And so this same hope is what gives us hope today in God's presence. Even when we can't feel him, we can hold on to his promises. We can hold on to what he has done in the past and believe that he will come again and do that ultimately for us. So because I think so often we try to find hope in our circumstances presently, and sometimes we may not be able to, right? And I think this is what a lot of the prophets are saying too, right? Ultimately, especially as they're getting towards the end, they're like, it's really kind of hopeless for Israel. They're done. But the Messiah is coming, right? Hope is not all lost, because even though Israel as a nation is done for, the Messiah is the one who's going to bring that ultimate presence and live among his people, and then ultimately through eternity.
I love this. So while you were sharing, I'm thinking God has always provided a sense of anticipation and expectation for all human beings. starting with Adam and Eve, the sense of expectation was pointing to Jesus, which is Emmanuel, which is God with us, the special presence of God in Jesus. And then after Jesus, of course, we're looking forward to the second coming of Jesus. And so I love the fact that God has always created this sense of expectation of Him coming to us, bringing His presence in a unique way um, to us, to humanity.
Yes. So
Hmm.
powerful.
All right. Well, let's then share some takeaways from this conversation.
I mean, I know for myself, my takeaway just kind of comes down to trying to like bring together these ideas that we've been having, at least the way that I'm feeling them. And I think so often the people who are struggling to feel God's presence are people that maybe we instinctively pull back from almost, because their questions make us uncomfortable, their anger makes us uncomfortable, their doubt or lack of faith or whatever we want to call it makes us uncomfortable, and we like to be around people who seem happier or seem full of faith. But for me, the thought that's coming to me is that perhaps it's the people who don't feel God's presence that most need my presence. And so I'm almost thinking like I could have a prophetic ministry by being with people who don't feel God is with them. And I do believe that through that experience, both they and I will experience God more deeply. Not because I'm coming in with answers, but because I'm just coming in to be their friend and be with them. And so for me, like I'm just sitting here and I'm trying to think like, is there anybody that I've been instinctively pulling back from that I need to lean into?
It's powerful.
My takeaway is that as much as we want the presence of God, God wants more.
Ooh.
So I just feel like we oftentimes we are like trying to search so hard, while like it might have just been that it was us trying to not let God to be in our presence. Because I can trust from my own experience that God is definitely the one who will be willing to be with us more than I do. So I think we can have faith in a lot of times when we just don't feel it.
Yeah.
Because God is the one that he will give us any type of different things. Like it could be through animals, I don't know, we are not in the time of the Old Testament, but it could be through nature, through animals, through people, through like teachers, professors. Like he will use any possible way to try to show that he's with us.
Yeah.
And he's in our presence. So I think we can trust that.
Yes. So good.
My takeaway is falls into those categories as well. How we can feel God's presence through others, and what it really has changed in my thinking is that maybe I shouldn't continue to think so inwardly to find God's presence, but maybe outwardly to friends and just other people who might not be just anyone who may have a different perspective. And I like the line where you said that rather than focusing on where is God, focus on God shining through you, because in that you can see the presence of God by focusing on towards others. And the question would be, are we really willing to seek God where he is trying to reveal himself to us?
Yeah, my takeaway is similar to that, in the aspect of I want to always make myself available to other people so I can be within their presence the same way God always makes himself available to us. And then in being with people in the time when they're hurting, it can remind me of when I'm hurting and I need God, so that in the times when I'm doing a little better and I almost forget God, I'm still there present with other people, so I won't forget that God is always present with me. And I really like what you said, Dr. Wells, towards the end, is that there's always the future hope there was the future hope of Jesus, and there's also the future hope of the second coming, even though they might not seem like an immediate hope in our situation right now. That's just powerful.
I think my
Help me through
takeaways.
many dark places. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. My takeaways along the same lines of as with what everyone else has shared, and that is in our search for God's presence. What is the reason why we want that? Is it just for our own blessing? I mean, that's okay to some extent, but when God comes in our lives in any way, it's never just for us because we're connected with other people. So whatever He blesses us with, like His presence, this is supposed to be a blessing for others. And I think that, yeah, that opens up a lot of doors that maybe we haven't seen before, of selflessness. So God's presence is something that we can easily share, if we understand it for what it truly is. I think it will just naturally become something that we share. I definitely enjoyed the conversation. I feel like I've taken some new insights from this, especially with how the focus of how the conversation was woven by the group and where the focus went. I think that's something to ponder for the future for sure. So Rahel, thank you for everything you shared and for listening to our comments as well. We really appreciate that.
Oh, it was a blessing to me too. I thought a lot more because of what you guys said as well. So it was really helpful.
Yeah, very, very helpful conversation for sure. Thank you also, Nicholas, Kian, Joseph, and Adrian. I appreciate your comments as well and your spiritual direction for each other and for our viewers. To those who have been watching the conversation, I hope it's been a blessing. If you would like to share anything in relation to this discussion, feel free to comment in Facebook and YouTube. We would love to hear from you. How did you relate to what was shared? What is your experience? What are some of the directions where you would take the discussion in your personal life? We always welcome those comments. And we also invite you to join us next time when Dr. Oliver Glantz, who is Associate Professor of Old Testament at NJU University, will continue the discussion of God's presence in the Old Testament and in the Bible. So we definitely encourage you to attend that episode as well. And until then, I wish you God's presence. And I wish you to learn more how to be God's presence to other people. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time.